Inspirational Creatives, episode 261.
I think the risk is personally, we wake up and say, well, whose life am I living?
Welcome to Inspirational Creatives. I'm your host, Rob Lawrence. Join me every Friday as I chat with successful artists, producers, and creative entrepreneurs who share powerful stories and strategies. They can help you to create the life that you want. Listen each week as these inspirational creatives show you how to take your creativity to the next level. You'll learn how to create a sustainable business that inspires others and gives you the financial freedom and lifestyle that you want. Thanks for listening. Make sure you sign up at inspirationalcreatives.com to get free exclusive bonus material. And now, on with the show. Rob here, and a very warm welcome to a very special episode of Inspirational Creatives. A happy Thanksgiving to my North American friends and to all of you wherever you are in the world. Today, I'm excited to announce that this podcast, Inspirational Creatives, is 4 years old. To celebrate this occasion, I'd like to introduce you to somebody who couldn't be a better fit for this show and is certainly no stranger to podcasts in the world of creative pursuits. He's someone who has shifted my own mindset and thinking recently, and if his iTunes reviews are anything to go by, evidently he's touched many others in the same way with his relatively new Tracking Wonder podcast. He's prolific, thoughtful and creative, and is someone who has a unique mind and perspective, and I've had the pleasure to work alongside him and his team from a distance on his podcast since being introduced by a mutual friend and previous guest from the very beginning of this Inspirational Creative series, Pam Slim. So I'm delighted to introduce to you today from the Hudson Valley, Jeffrey Davis. Jeffrey, welcome.
Thank you, Rob. What a kind introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here.
So how is the Hudson Valley today?
Hudson Valley is, it's about 90 minutes north of New York City and along the Hudson River, near the Catskill Mountains for listeners who aren't familiar. It's a bit rainy, drizzly, and cloudy, but the fall foliage is really stunning this week.
Wow. Yeah, it's that time of year. I remember traveling up through the Hudson Valley probably about 15 years ago on the train around this time of year, and it was absolutely stunning.
It is, and it's really changing. You know, it's been a place, it's been a hub for artists and visionaries and others for, 150 years or so. But really, in the past 5-6 years, we've had like a new wave, both of younger farmers, but younger entrepreneurial farmers, as well as a new creative tech wave coming into a few small cities up here. So Google is actually seeking talent up here, and businesses are shifting their headquarters due north, where you've got a little bit of the best of the calmer country life, but not too far away from New York City.
Yeah, got you. So have you always lived there? Did you grow up there?
No, actually, I grew up in Fort Worth, Texas, quite a different world, and went to college at UT Austin, and then found my way up here in about 2002 or so.
And what was it specifically that attracted you?
Two things. One summer that I came up here for an artist residency at Bird Cliff in Woodstock, where I soon later lived, and then immediately. Before that, I got a residency at the Zen Mountain Monastery with an angle on arts and Zen Buddhism. So I got to work with lots of wonderful people during that time. So I came up here for a whole summer and then decided I wasn't leaving.
And has that inspired some of the work that you do today in that sense?
Completely. The artist residency, the writer's residency was wonderful to ground me down into a book project and gain a community of other writers and artists up here. So having that community has been really important. And certainly the Zen practice has been instrumental in terms of how I ground down in creative full life every day. And yeah, it informs pretty much everything that I do and how I do it.
Tell me more about that. That sounds fascinating in terms of, do you have specific rituals or approaches when it comes to your creative work in that sense?
Yeah, so I recognize, I guess, in looking back on my life, I've questioned a lot about the way we live our lives, probably since I was a teenager, and when I was at UT Austin, I was questioning quite a bit and had really sought even in my 20s, as I was teaching courses and advancing my life as a writer, I was just always very curious about how to live my life artfully, intentionally, deliberately. I was very inspired at the time at 19 by Henry Thoreau and his whole approach to living deliberately. So that's been an ongoing theme since I was very young. So in some ways, maybe I was fortunate to have that sort of inspiration. And so I was attracted to Zen principally for that, because I viewed it as a series of practices that would help me live my life more artfully and intentionally. And I was right. Once I had been trying to practice meditation for years through my 20s, but really failed. And so, yes, I came away from that residency, went directly into the writer's residency, and felt really equipped to keep my distractible mind focused and to keep my anxious mind on purpose as I was working on this book proposal. And and being a creative person, you're on your own. You have no supervisor with telling you what you need to do and when and so forth. So I found Zen not only helpful in cultivating daily deliberate focus, increased self-awareness, but just really ongoing how to approach even the hours of my days with more thoughtfulness. So fast forward all these years forward, do I have any rituals? I have a regular morning practice that only takes maybe 20 to 25 minutes long. It's a series of yoga postures and breathing and brief seated Zen meditation, and followed by kind of a tracking wonder journaling process that I've just developed because I found no other journal or daily planner that's really fit my needs. So that's all part of, I would say, my daily morning practice. I guess you would call all of those practices rituals, I would say.
I'm fascinated actually to learn more about how you've been able to direct your distracted mind and your anxious mind, as you frame it, into a creative practice, writing. In my experience and working with creatives, sometimes the more creative we become, the more distracted we become, the more anxious we become about other things as well as our own creativity. So I'd love to learn more about how do you focus those things?
Yes, I do think that's a central matter. I have observed in my own life, as well as numerous people with whom I've worked, that you're right. There is a correlation between a creative mind and a potentially anxious mind, and not all anxiety is bad per se. I think the more creative we are, the more curious we are, and vice versa. And so the more curious we are, the more prone we are to be distracted by many different ideas. The more sensitive we are to our surroundings, the more potential we are distracted by other stimulation and so forth. So I did notice early on, when I was in grad school, actually, that I was probably distractible. Had I grown up in the 90s, I probably would have been diagnosed with ADD or something. But I did notice that, and I observed that, and I thought, my gosh, am I ever going to get through, my thesis in just a matter of months? And it was then that I really started trying to learn meditation. This is years before that Zen residency. And so fast forward, like over the past couple of decades, I've ongoingly studied different tools for increased focus, and including yogic breathing, which really does. I've done all of the research that correlates certain yogic breathing tools with the neuroscience to help me understand why I did develop the capacity to focus for really long periods of time. So I do a few things maybe that will help your listeners. I'm very intentional with my activities. And so that means that when I'm engaged in a project that requires several steps, whether it's for a client or my own or for my business Tracking Wonder, I'm very intentional, and I check in with personally, why am I devoted to this particular project? It's a question I ask and write down every morning, what I'm devoted to, so that I have some sense of direct purpose to a project, day in, day out. And I also am adamant and obsessive about shaping my time. So that means that every week I go through and shape when I'm going to work on certain projects, because I always have multiple projects going on that I'm trying to advance. And then every morning I revisit the day's planned flow, because I know it's always going to shift. And I monitor that flow on an ongoing basis just to help me stay, let's say, maybe use this metaphor, to help my mind stay in place for 90 minutes, right? And just say, okay, I'm not going to write a book today. I'm going to develop this one piece for 90 minutes. And then that frees up some of the anxiety by putting those limits on my mind. The devotion and getting connected to my sense of purpose helps direct my focus and motivate myself to stay focused instead of get distracted.
You mentioned there about adjusting, going with the flow there, and I suppose, without wanting to put words into your mouth, sort of changing our own expectations. How do you deal with that? How do you deal with when you have this master plan, you've then got the daily tactical plan that fits into the master plan, and then things take a different direction that you have to go with the flow? I mean, how do you manage that? What approaches do you take to put yourself at peace, at ease with that stuff?
That's a great question. I think anybody that works with me knows that I have high expectations, and I have high expectations of myself. I have high expectations of life and of every day, which means, I often set myself up for the realities of what happens. So one thing that I do is I just go in knowing that my vision of any project, or even my vision of how a day is going to flow, it's always going to have to be adjusted. I think the Zen practice gave me, as well as even the yogic practice, is the ability to give a project everything I've got, and give every hour and every 90 minutes as much as I've got, and then to follow that up with letting go of outcome. So those two things actually go together as a team mantra as well, or a team motto as well. So when we're launching something or developing something, we always say to each other, okay, we have to give this everything we've got, and then we can let go of outcome. But we can't let go of outcome until we've given it everything we've got. So knowing, for your listeners, adjusting expectations is always important every day. So knowing the vision of your project is always going to exceed in its idealism the realities of actually executing a project. And then adjusting daily plans. We're always anticipating as a team what the challenges are going to be for any given day, and then just being ready to adjust. But if we've done some planning ahead of time, and even personally for me as a creative, if I've done my weekly time shaping, my monthly time shaping, my daily time shaping, at least I go in with a plan that I can adjust from. If I don't go in with any plan, then I'm at the whim of everybody else's urgencies, and then I'm being more reactive instead of proactive and creative.
And for me, that's a fascinating balance to manage too, in terms of protecting your creative time versus, the need to get back to the project plan, get back to the emails. How do you manage that on a daily basis, just out of curiosity?
Well, with self-forgiveness, but also many practices. So I'm always aware of my distractibility. If I know that after my morning practice, like I have a set of like 5 things I try to do roughly in some sequence in the mornings, still knowing I have a 4-year-old and 9-year-old little girl who might shift my morning plans as well. And then once I'm really at work, whether it's on my own projects or clients' projects or business development, I'm fairly disciplined, not perfect in any way, at staying off of email. And I'll tell my team or certain team members, I'm not going to be checking email for the next number of hours. If there's a real urgency, call me, but don't count on me to be responsive to email. So I'm pretty good about that. If I think that I'm not going to be, and this is typical too in terms of the psychology of distractibility. If I've been working really hard after an hour, hour and a half, 2 hours, my mind naturally is going to get tired. My frontal lobe is going to shut down. And then that's when I'm prone to just like slip down the email rabbit hole. And if I know that is my tendency in advance, I'll use an application like Self-Control. Self-Control is a free app where I can blacklist all of the distracting news websites that I may go to just to see what will irritate me in politics these days as part of my distractibility. And so I can blacklist all of those websites. I can even blacklist incoming and outgoing email for up to 24 hours. And I can set that time parameter. It's called Self-Control in case you need help with your self-control. So,
I love it.
So that's the way I really, like I say, I'm pretty obsessive about time shaping, and I try to train other team members also to really assume agency over shaping your time and then adjusting. And I am protective of my own creative projects and of my own non-client work. So our clients know that generally 3 or 4 days out of the month, I schedule in advance deep dive retreats. 3 or 4 days out of every month of the year, I'm typically not involved in client work. That allows me to work on my own creative projects, or if there's something related to Tracking Wonder, like our 4-day live events that I just really need to devote concerted creative time to, that's part of what those retreats are for. I just want to emphasize that too for your listeners, because you raised a really important issue, I'm sure, for your listeners, which is, and I get this all of the time, even from prospects and other clients, is how do I protect my time for my own creative projects versus other demands? And my response is you have to assume some agency over your own time every day, every week, every month, and plan for that designated time in advance.
What I love about that is it's a sense of priority, I feel. I see so many creatives get stuck with their own work when they're putting everyone else's priorities before their own important creative work. Whereas I feel and again, this is something I've learned through listening to your podcast with your guests. It's sometimes about, if I don't do this work that's so important to me, I'm not self-nurturing in that sense. So I can't give my all to all the other stuff. Is that true for you?
Yes, with a variation. I think it's really important for us each to check in with what is that work that seems to be uniquely calling us, or that is unique to our own creative abilities and strengths. And the other piece, though, is mindset where you don't create a civil war with yourself and your work. That is, you don't create this unnecessary battle of your own creative work versus your business development or your clients or customers' work. Then you just create a real antagonism toward, what could be really wonderful and fulfilling work. So it really assume, and we encourage our clients to assume, an integrated approach that, your creative work can be part and parcel of your business work, and they can really feed and inform one another. I feel buoyed and uplifted in part from the work that I do with clients. And so if I'm prioritizing their work in such a way that I'm not feeling any creative engagement, I take responsibility for that. And similar, as a father of 2 young girls, I really enjoy being with them. So I want to prioritize that and not set up some sort of unnecessary battle about my time with them versus with my creative work, if that makes sense. So I establish boundaries around all of those facets of my life.
What I really like about that there, Jeffrey, is you've reminded me of the really fulfilling creative work that we can do when we're collaborating with others, and not to think about our own creative faculties, I suppose, in isolation.
That's completely it. Yes. I mean, that's my whole approach. When I really started to take having a business and building a business seriously, I thought, well, I will do it my way, and it's going to have to be in part creatively fulfilling. And I think, in fact, the clients that work with us with branding or in terms of advancing their own thought leadership and their intellectual assets find that our whole approach is creative and it is collaborative. So I think I've just been kind of insistent in forming a business that is also creatively fulfilling for myself as well as for our clients.
You mentioned your 2 young girls there. I'd love to know, I could be opening myself up here for a large answer. I appreciate that. But I would love to know what you've learned from them about your own creative abilities. What have you learned from them about creativity?
That's a great question, actually. And I learned different things from our 9-year-old versus our 4-year-old. So with the firstborn, one was I actually realized that's when I started taking shaping time more seriously, because I realized I had to have a different relationship to time. So one thing she inadvertently taught me, and I know this is not exactly what you're thinking, but she inadvertently taught me to take ownership of my time. The second thing she taught me is that I am an ongoing creative problem solver. And I know this just by virtue of what my wife has reflected back to me. So I wake up anticipating challenges during the day. And that's also part of the Zen mindset, I'm sure. I'm not trying to avoid challenges and problems. I mean, to be creative means you just find ways to track those challenges and problems. So, a child is, just brings about a whole new host of unexpected challenges on an ongoing basis. And so I have found with some degree of creative awareness that a lot of my parenting has been creative problem solving. I created so many songs on the spot when our firstborn was just a few weeks old because she cried all of the time. And I was just inventing songs while walking her, trying to quiet her down, and her fears would come up and I would try to find indirect creative ways to redirect her moods and so forth. So that's one thing. Now, the flip side, and maybe what you intended too, is in watching both girls, I think I've had some things reinforced, is that we do learn to be creative by watching and observing. We learn from others. Creativity doesn't come out of nothing. We learn by observing and we learn by modeling sometimes. And then we just learn by getting messy and testing things out. So my 9-year-old actually just surprised me Sunday morning. I send out a Sunday dispatch to all of our subscribers. And then she surprised me with a handwritten Sunday newsletter that laid out all of the headlines for her new projects. So if anything, they both have reinforced that we're each innately creative. And that means that we're each innately capable of coming up with fresh, new approaches to how we live and how we make things. And I think they've just reinforced the beauty of that fact that we're, regardless of what field we're playing and working in, we're each creative and we can approach our work lives creatively or reactively. It's a whole different approach. I find a creative approach to life to be one of agency and intention.
With that thought in mind, you mentioned there making up songs, a multitude of songs on the spot, I can imagine. What ways do you choose to express yourself creatively?
Writing foremostly, and that's been true since I was a boy. My father gave me a few pivotal tools when I was a boy. He gave me his father's day book when I was maybe 7 or 8 and told me I could write down my thoughts and ideas in there, which I didn't know I had them to write down. I could barely write my name. But that really planted an ongoing life habit. And then he was in media and advertising. And so he had all these cool tools like a typewriter. And then he let me use his typewriter when I was in 4th grade and I started writing stories, fiction stories. And then he gave me a recorder because he was always recording his ideas and an audio recorder. So he would give me his old ones. And that was probably the genesis for podcasting, because a friend of mine and I would actually go around our neighborhood pretending we were young reporters for a local television station and asking grown-ups if they wouldn't mind asking asking them a few questions. So,
Amazing.
yeah, so writing, audio, drawing, those all stay with me. And so writing books, articles, essays, writing and publishing poetry, these are all definite ways in which I, explore my creativity and share it. And then I'm very serious that my approach to business is also another way in which my creativity and my unique approaches emerge. We call our clients and community members business artists, and one of the greatest compliments is when an executive or head of a law firm or other professional says, and this is what a client recently said last week, was, I really feel like a business artist now, which means they can approach their decisions and their challenges more deliberately, creatively, and artfully. I really do try to, approach my business that way too. But yeah, specifically writing and audio and drawing are still my personal medium.
I love this term, business artists. I can imagine how for some, and perhaps that person that you mentioned there, that could be, certainly for somebody of my disposition, quite a liberating idea.
Yeah, on both ends. So there's the business person, like this lawyer, a business person who wants to feel artful and creative, and again feel as if she or he has some agency over how the business is developing. So it is very liberating for that end. And then for the creatively disposed, as certainly when I was an undergrad, a freshman, all of my friends were going right into business and accounting and pre-law. And so I thought, oh, well, I'll major in business too, I guess. But I kind of dreaded the idea at the time. And so I went left into humanities and English, and then went further left into poetics and philosophy. And then circled back around to business in a very different generation, very different outlook for what business can be. And so it's been liberating for creatively disposed people to feel like they have some agency over systems and business and relationship building and branding and marketing in a way that is creative, genuine, and effective. So yeah, I think both parts of that business artist have been liberating for people in our clientele.
I was going to ask you, and I will ask you actually, about when you came up with the idea for Tracking Wonder, but can you remember when you came up with that concept,
Yes.
of the business artist?
Yes, I do actually. 4 or 5 years ago, I remember I was just noticing after we had led different events and we were building this international online community, that combined, because I'm always observing cultural trends, I was sensing I wasn't the only one who was, as I say, like hungering for a different way of business than at least the notion that I grew up with in the 20th century, that, it was all about profit. It was all about profit for the shareholders and stakeholders, and you just treated people like customers who are buying things and so forth. All of that felt pretty sterile to me. And I realized I wasn't the only one. And I wasn't, again, people in business and people in the creative fields mutually were sensing that they were hungering for something else. So it was then that I thought I was going to write another small booklet. But then a friend said, scrap it all except for this page. And so I was like, okay, I think you're right. It is this page that seems to be almost like a manifesto. And it was in shaping that piece that I came up with this phrase, business artist, as a way to describe what seemed to be holding all of us together. And it was actually that then led to us to put together a short manifesto film on business as unusual. And that's when we started promoting the idea of business artist. And just as you're saying, like, we got responses from around the world and on Twitter, and people say, oh my gosh, that's what I am. I'm a business artist, which was just again, it's like a great affirmation that you're onto something and you're helping people see who they are and who they can be in the creative fields and in business.
Yeah. And with that thought in mind, this business of seeing people about who they can be, that's an essence I very much pick up on within Tracking Wonder. So how did that lead to Tracking Wonder? How did the ideas for Tracking Wonder then come about you?
Tracking Wonder, the project, started years earlier, even back around 2005 or so. And it's probably a combination of a couple of things that cinched it. So it started as a research project because I was involved in other research, not only with Zen, but I'd been studying psychology for a number of years. And I had studied Abraham Maslow's ideas of peak experience for, a number of years back in the 90s, but I'd come across his journals in the last year and a half of his life after he suffered his first of 2 heart attacks. He was challenging his own ideas about peak experiences. And for your listeners who don't know, he had laid out like these descriptions of when we have these almost transcendent peak experiences which Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi would later pursue in his descriptions of flow. And Maslow started to question the whole pursuit of peak experiences and was observing in a new introduction that people can get addicted to pursuing peak experiences, and they can get addicted to, probably what we would say is like that creative flow bliss that we get for maybe 10 minutes. And we're like, oh, I want more of that. Yeah. And he described what he called plateau experiences, which are this ability to experience the beauty and poignancy and reality of very ordinary moments, whether it's eating oatmeal or looking up at your loved one with whom you've shared 1,000 meals and suddenly seeing that person in a new, true way. And so that was really speaking to what I had been pursuing for a long time. And the more I started to research people's ideas of wonder, which have been largely in the West, largely philosophers and theologians who've written quite a bit about wonder over the centuries, I realized that's what I was pursuing all along. And so Tracking Wonder began as a research project, and it was a way for me to, write, to maybe put some things in book form and so forth. My wife, who among her many talents also had been trained by 2 foremost animal trackers, and you track animals not to hunt them down, according to these 2 teachers, but to try to understand their ways. And so that combo is like, I'm tracking wonder. I'm tracking this weird, evasive animal, sort of the red fox of emotions. That's what I've always been pursuing. That's really what I want to shape much of my endeavors toward. And so, well, that became the name of our consultancy. It became the name of our community. It's the name of our podcast. But the real litmus test, Rob, I think that cinched the practices of Tracking Wonder came, within about 2 years of major personal challenges, health challenges, or roaring house and studio fire. Right at the same time, we decided to get pregnant with our first child and so forth, that I really thought, okay, I need to see if I can practice, right, what I'm writing about and researching and been trying to test out. And it was during, of course, those hard times and challenges that I recognized the profundity of tracking this elusive experience called wonder.
And what does wonder mean to you?
So, I do have 2 young girls, and I see how wonder shows up for them. But, being a child is not all wondrous. It's kind of disorienting, which is also wondrous sometimes. So I often say that wonder is not kid stuff. Wonder is very grown-up stuff. Wonder, according to one anthropologist, it's the hallmark of the human species. And I consider it so important because it's like this quiet disruptor of default living and thinking. So it's quiet. It's not joy. It's not curiosity. It's not awe. It's this quiet experience we have when sometimes just for a few moments, our view of ourselves, our view of each other, our view of our surroundings, our view of a creative project, suddenly we see it in a new and true way. And so that's what it means, quote, means to me. And it is something that I do track every day and attempt to instill in other people and foster in other people.
The current series of the Tracking Wonder podcast is very much about designing for wonder. Could you tell us a little bit more about how you would design for wonder, given what you've learned so far?
Yeah. So, part of this idea of designing for wonder is, as one artist friend reflected back to me a couple of years ago, he said, "Boy, you always have your head under the hood of creativity, don't you?" And what he meant by that is that I'm always looking to see how things work. And because I've studied story and story architecture and film and books and experiences for a long time, I could kind of see how, in some ways, loosely, how filmmakers or writers were doing what they were doing. And so wonder just seems like the experience that you absolutely cannot design for. I mean, most people think, oh, well, this is a spontaneous, pure experience, which it is. Like, certainly it is. And it arises sometimes by delightful surprise. And yeah, we can design for it. And most filmmakers and artists and creative writers know this, and probably theologians know it too, that we can design for it. And so I went into the second season with that premise that wonder is not only accidental, but it is something we can design for, and it's something we might aspire to design for other people, to actually design experiences for our clients and customers and communities, or our loved ones, or our teammates. And so I wanted to start with that premise and then invite people from a variety of fields, a filmmaker, a video game innovator, an installation artist, a museum curator, the executive director of the Exploratorium, researchers, and then see if that premise holds up. So that's where part of the impetus for the second season has come from.
That's amazing. For you, your own journey with the podcast, what stood out for you? I mean, what do you know now that you didn't know before you started the podcast? Many things, I'm sure, but specifically about wonder.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'll answer that too by going back many years ago when I first thought I was going to write a book about wonder. I realized that the outline was everything I already thought I knew about wonder, and it was pretty flat. And so I thought, I really need to live and track it more and stay in that state of not knowing, which is, wonder crosses this space, this liminal space between not knowing and knowing, and unknowing what we think we know. So it's always putting us in that perspective and that humility. So I love your question, because I had to go in with that premise, but not try to force the premise. And so two things have come actually from the podcast and even from some wonder intervention workshops we've been testing out similarly. I would say that one is that wonder is alive and well in many domains. I really see confirmation that so many people in so many different fields are attuned to this idea of designing for insight, designing for disorientation, designing for openness. So that's been really remarkable. And the other piece that's just really come out in the past year in tandem with the season on the podcast is that wonder has a really essential social dimension. And I think being generally introverted and creative, and as somebody who has found a lot of meaning and fulfillment, both in creative solitude and in sometimes remote natural surroundings. That's really where I was driven when I was younger. I think this has been the most surprising part, delightfully surprising part, is that wonder has this essential social dimension that it really can foster openness between people. And in your collaborative work, and sometimes if you're working with teams, is that people on teams and people in workplaces, like, they naturally, this is what we do as human beings, just naturally by survival, we're forming all of these implicit biases toward each other. And we go to a team meeting, we're like, oh yeah, I know what he's going to say, or I know what she's going to write. We sort of box people in. And we do this with our loved ones. We do it, with people that we've come to know for a long time. And wonder can, again, momentarily dissolve our biases toward each other so we can see each other in a new way, in a more true way, maybe in a more beautiful way. I can feel the emotion actually welling up in me as I'm absorbing that fact, because I think that surprising part of wonder has helped me recognize all the more why it's important for us to foster more wonder in work, in our communities, with even people we don't know or don't seem to know. I would say in this very new world, that part has been the most surprising and important.
That's fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating to hear. In that sense, do you think that, I don't know if skill is the right word, but is this a skill that we can develop? Perhaps the design element, I mean.
Yeah, well, the design element is a skill you can develop and practice. Like any good art, it's probably never perfectible. And the funny thing, of course, is with something like designing for wonder or designing for any emotional experiences, you have to go back maybe to that motto: give it everything you've got and then let go of outcome. So, for instance, we've hosted a live 4-day event a couple of weeks ago, and it was like every day in many ways, my teammate and I were designing for insight and wonder and creative collaboration. And then a key part of day 3 was actually me giving them experience in trying to create such experiences for their own communities and their own clients. So I've kind of even typified 6 kinds of experiences that we can learn to design for. So yeah, it's a set of skills that we can practice doing, that people on teams can do for each other, for their customers, for their clients. But I don't think if you try to over perfect it, you'll run part of the joy of just watching the flexibility of what happens.
Yeah. I was going to ask you about your brand artistry labs. It's something I don't know a lot about, actually, and given how closely I've been working with you on the podcast side of things. But I understand they're an immersive event, a 4-day event of such, and which sounds incredibly exciting to someone like me. Is that something you teach within that framework?
Yes, exactly. So in fact, this 4-day event we led a couple of weeks ago was one of the brand artistry labs, and they are very exciting. They're limited to just 10 people. And, they're coming out of, a set of problems we had recognized that many individuals and even organizations don't really grasp what effective branding is in the 21st century. And part of what I know about how human beings learn is we typically learn best by collaborating, by doing hands-on work. And we often learn by testing things out. And 2, some of our clients wanted the opportunity to meet and work with one another in live scenarios. So we created these labs, and we host 3 a year. And they're based on certain principles that experimentation is essential. And so you really do learn how to experiment with your branding. You really learn immediately from day 1 how to collaborate with others and how to appreciate other people's creative talents that might be different from yours. So collaboration is really crucial for success in the 21st century. And we kind of operate with brand artists and business artists, we say they create like an artist. So you really do learn how to problem solve for your branding through the frameworks we take you through. You learn how to tap into your imagination and your emotional intelligence like an effective artist. But we also say you experiment like a scientist. So you learn how to break things down and create prototypes of certain offers or experiences. And then you earn like an entrepreneur. You find ways to market effectively and artfully, all aimed to elevate people instead of manipulate people.
I love that. Yeah, you must have some success stories from the back of these events.
Yeah,
you run a few a year.
Yes. And this is our first year to run them. And we run 3 a year. And yeah, some of our clients, like an organization 40 years in existence that's never really taken its own branding seriously. Part of what we saw with that organization, as well as with many people who come through our labs, is that the very process itself, it does a couple of things that they're not expecting. Kind of oppose this process to like the conventional branding agency of the 20th century that would come in and say, okay, we'll do your branding for you. And so our clients and what we call our lab partners, they come away invested in their own branding. They come away really clear about the promise that they deliver on. And they realize, oh, if this is what I'm saying my brand promises to deliver on, that means I have to rise to it. So this organization, 40 plus years in existence, takes its branding seriously. And after our process, some people on the board of directors said, oh, now we need to step up and deliver on this promise. And that motivated them to create all kinds of wonderful experiences. So that's what we see consistently is people gain the confidence and clarity on what the promise is they deliver on. They have the skill set to handle some of the daily challenges they're going to have in branding and building their business. So they have that empowerment and that sense of agency. And then, they step up and they're motivated, right, to be better in terms of how they show up for their clientele or their customers or their community.
Yeah, that's amazing. I wanted to just quickly come back to the wonder part of our conversation. I'd love to have your take on why you believe creativity and following our curiosity, and particularly following our wonder, or being able to track our wonder, is so important in the world today.
In the world today, it's so hard to get perspective on our times, isn't it? But I'm always, again, trying to get a sense of what our times are about. So that question, why it's important for our times, if we just look around at our times, we have a lot of challenges. And so maybe I would answer it, beyond the personal fulfillment piece and just really look, at the times that we live in. I really feel like we together as a human species need ways to trip open our closed minds. And we need fresh ways to help us open up to each other, open up to the environmental, social, other challenges that we face, both within our businesses and outside of our businesses. And that, to me, this is where the wonder comes in. It means to approach every day's challenges, personal and transpersonal, with creativity, with curiosity instead of fear. To approach those days' challenges with perhaps the intention to design to delight somebody else, right? To shift the focus away from one's self, to really open up to what is possible in our lives. That I just feel like, the greater our challenges in our times, the more I feel we need to foster a culture of openness and wonder, and never settle for, well, that's the way we've always done things. I think we always need to be questioning that statement.
Yeah. Would you say, from your experience, Jeffrey, that this is a case of being more comfortable with our vulnerability?
Yes, with our vulnerability. Well, I would say my greatest vulnerability as a young man in my 20s, sometimes standing, in a classroom of undergrads who weren't much younger than me or sometimes older, my greatest vulnerability back then was not to know something and not to have the answer to their questions. My greatest vulnerability was not being the smartest one in the room, in that sort of climate. And I feel like my greatest vulnerability is allowing myself not to know and to be comfortable with that not knowing. And the emotional vulnerability of really acknowledging what we really care about and who we really care about in this world. So yes, I would say it's really being vulnerable for all of us and your listeners to be vulnerable and leaning into the discomfort of not having the answers to our challenges, but still showing up and trying to find solutions anyway. Whether it's, an executive trying to find a different approach with her business, or the doctor who refuses to dial it in when seeing patients, right? Or just some young entrepreneur who wants a fresh way to help business owners stay fit fiscally and physically. I really want those people to approach their lives and our collective challenges, yes, with more vulnerability and not knowing and still staying curious anyway.
What do you feel the risk of not taking an approach like that is for all of us going forward?
The risk of just saying, well, that's the way we've always done things, and sort of waking up and dialing in the days.
Yeah, right. Taking a more open perspective, as you were describing there.
Yeah. Well, the Talking Heads song that has the refrain, letting the days go by.
Yeah.
I go back to those lyrics where, I think he says, this is not my beautiful wife. This is not my beautiful house. My God, what have I done? I think the risk is, personally, we wake up and say, well, whose life am I living? I've just been letting the days go by, and I've just gone through my days in this default approach with blinders on. And so that's the personal risk. And of course, the great collective social risk is we forget our fundamental humanity in connecting with one another, and our fundamental capacity to create, to really generate some novel, useful, fresh ways to live, to work, and to play.
Jeffrey, I could speak with you all evening, as it is
You
here,
too.
all afternoon. I'm sure it is there, about this stuff. I love it, and I love listening to you. And I'm not saying this from a biased perspective, I really genuinely love the podcast. As I said to you off air before we got speaking, I talk more about your podcast than I do my own these days, because of the wonder it creates in me about how we could look at things.
And I just want to say, you contributed a great part to helping me get comfortable in conceiving and leaning into that podcast. It didn't come with a whole lot of, it came with a lot of resistance on my part. So thank you for helping me navigate that part.
Oh, you're very welcome. You've done a fine job. With that in mind, and conscious of your time today, I'd love to ask you some closing questions, if I may, before we wrap up. So one of the questions I love to ask all of my guests is, what's inspired you recently?
What's inspired me recently, related to what we're talking about, it's anything that gives me perspective on what's happening around the globe, that people are doing things to help the world. So I hope this doesn't sound self-serving, but I would say our online community, that every Friday they share the work that they're doing around the globe. And it's literally inspiring to me, because I think we can get stuck in our silos of what we think is real. So yeah, anything that helps me see that people are doing good in the world, that there are businesses with a conscience out in the world, that definitely inspires me.
Yeah. Related to that, is there anything specific that stood out for you today that you feel grateful for, that's perhaps surprised you today?
Well, I'm grateful for this conversation. Genuinely, I'm really grateful for connections with people like you. I think in relation to our conversation, my daily practices that ground me in work that matters, I'm certainly grateful for that. I'm grateful for my family that connects me to so much joy. And I'm grateful for my team at Tracking Wonder that just keeps our vision alive and often keeps me buoyant and going. Yeah, I think all those things were reinforced in our conversation today. Yeah.
Yeah. Finally, where can our listener find out more about you, Tracking Wonder, and your other work, of course, Jeffrey?
Sure. Yeah, trackingwonder.com. I'd love for your listeners to come on board there. I do release a Sunday dispatch with a pretty substantial article once a week. They can check out brandartistrylabs.com since we talked about that. They can find me on Instagram, Jeffrey Davis 11. That would give them a good introduction.
That's fabulous. So I'll put all of those links into the episode show notes, of course, Jeffrey. And my gratitude to you for such a wonderful conversation today. I've learned a lot here. I've got notes taken all the way through. So I'm looking forward to exploring more off the back of our conversation today. So thank you for that, Jeffrey.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you for your caring and thank you for the work that you do too. It's really, really important.
Thanks for listening. Nothing beats the stories and advice of an expert to help you raise your creative game. I would love to know what you thought about today's episode, so don't forget to subscribe in iTunes where you can rate and review the show. If you like this episode, I invite you to share it on Facebook or Twitter with the one person you know who will benefit from the wisdom shared here today. You can find the show notes on inspirationalcreatives.com/podcast. If you have a burning question or a great idea for a guest, head on over to inspirationalcreatives.com/contact, where you can connect with me there. This episode of Inspirational Creatives is hosted on the podcast platform Libsyn. If you're thinking of starting your own podcast and if you're looking for a podcast host, Libsyn is the podcast hosting platform that the Inspirational Creatives podcast has been reliably hosted on since launching in November 2014. If you'd like to give it a try, I'm pleased to share with you the promo code CREATIVE, which you can use on libsyn.com. That promo code is good for up to 2 months free trial. If you use the code at the beginning of a month, then you'll receive all of that month and the next month free. However, if you use the promo code later in the month, you'll get the remainder of that month free and the following month free too. That promo code is CREATIVE, which you can use on libsyn.com.